describes some of the main issues our election system is facing. We have one side actively attempting to throw its opponent in prison and bankrupt his family. Again, reminiscent of Soviet Russia.
Molly Hemingway is the author of Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. She criticized, among other things, the fact that elections take much longer than they used to.
The situation is so absurd that we have presidential and gubernatorial debates weeks after some people have already voted. We flood addresses across the country with tens of millions of unsupervised mail-in ballots months ahead of elections, frequently to locations from which voters, if they're even alive, have long since moved.
Some lawmakers at the hearing focused on private funds flowing to election offices. They say that unlike political contributions, these funds are not regulated. In 2020, tech entrepreneur Mark Zuckerberg and his wife reportedly donated $350 million, which ultimately ended up at local election offices. Most of the money went to predominantly Democratic districts in swing states across the country. Republicans allege that the money was then used to increase Democrats' voter turnout. The committee's chairman compared the situation to this week's Super Bowl, in which San Francisco will play.
If the refs were paid for by a tech billionaire from San Francisco, this wouldn't instill confidence in the game. The same goes for our elections administration. Undue private influence distorts Americans' confidence in our election.
Multiple Republicans at the hearing made clear that the private funding of election offices should be made illegal. Democrats said conservatives should let go of their claims of voter fraud in 2020.
In New Hampshire, authorities have identified the culprit behind a round of AI-generated spam calls pretending to be President Biden. They were all traced back to the Texas-based Life Corporation. According to State Attorney General John Pomela, up to 24,000 fake calls were made just 2 days before the primary, urging voters to stay home and vote in November instead. At a press conference, Pomela said the robocalls came 2 weeks after the DNC sent out a memo calling the primary vote meaningless and non-binding. Pomela then sent a cease and desist letter to the DNC, ordering it to stop making such statements. California braces for more atmospheric rivers while assessing the aftermath of the recent storms. A small break in the rain gives Southern Californians a chance to gauge cleanup efforts. NTD's Stephanie Sakal reports.
While it's currently sunny out, Southern California is bracing for additional atmospheric river storms after days of intense rainfall.
It's a backup power system of its own, so it's independent of the power grid if it needs to be. The whole idea is ridiculous.
And what about China?
Well, most of the solar panels and other devices connected with solar energy are made in China. So it's almost certain that if they actually go through with this ridiculous idea, that the stuff will come from China.
There are numerous concerns of Chinese espionage in a numerous array of fields here, but if they are actually going to procure these solar panels, most of those materials would be made in China, and especially the components. Is that right?
That's right. The lithium, anything lithium battery related, anything lithium related in the solar cells, all that would come from China, directly or indirectly. I mean, you may have an American label on it, but it would come from China. Or you would have a Southeast Asian label on it, but it comes from China. They just make final assembly. And by the way, Mr. Biden vetoed legislation from Congress 2 days ago that would have stopped waivers for the Southeast Asian countries who are fronting Chinese stuff to the United States.
In some lighter news, communities across Asia are preparing to welcome the Lunar New Year on February 10th.
Appeals court on Tuesday rejected Trump's claim that he's immune from prosecution in the January 6th case. The former president's expected to appeal that ruling.
And for some legal analysis on the Supreme Court's impending decision on Trump's eligibility to hold office, we hear from Paul Kamenar, the lead counsel at the National Legal and Policy Center. Paul, really appreciate your time today. The facts: Trump did not hold office before the Civil War and did not support the Confederacy afterwards. He's never been charged or convicted of inciting an insurrection. So how could the Supreme Court possibly use that clause to disqualify him?
Yeah, you're right. Good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, that was a clause that was enacted after the Civil War, and it did disqualify certain those who were involved in the Confederacy. But that provision is meant to go forward, so that's not really the issue. The issue is before the court is, well, first of all, Trump did not commit any insurrection or rebellion. But the court need not even get to that. There are a couple of legal issues before that that they will decide, and I think they will rule on those legal issues, not the factual issue of whether or not Trump engaged in any insurrection or rebellion.
Okay, so Paul, what are some of those procedural issues?
Sure. The one that's front and center is, does this amendment even apply to the president, Trump or any president, because it does not mention the president in its clause. It mentions members of Congress, members of the Senate, president-electors, vice president-electors, and then it says other officers of the United States who took an oath of office. And so the other side says, yeah, he's not mentioned, but, you know, we'll sweep him into this catch-all clause that it says officers of the United States. But the Supreme Court has ruled that officers of the United States are those who are appointed to office, not members of Congress who are elected, not the president, etc. And so it's clear that he's not mentioned. So I think that argument is going to be front and center. The second argument is whether or not Congress has to enact what's called enabling legislation to put a law down to define exactly what does insurrection and rebellion mean. You can't have 50 different states deciding what they think it means. And so the second argument, that's a legal one, is whether Congress has to act first in terms of enacting legislation. And then
well, there's certainly a lot to unpack here for the court. Arlene, thank you for that report. President Trump was not in the courtroom, but he did make a comment after the arguments concluded.
In watching the Supreme Court today, I thought it's a very beautiful process. I hope that democracy in this country will continue, because right now we have a very, very tough situation with all of the radical left ideas, with the weaponization of politics. They weaponize it like it's never been weaponized before. It's totally illegal, but they do it anyway, and it has to stop. Every one of the court cases that I'm involved, every single one, civil, whether it's the attorney generals or the district attorneys. You look at Fani in Georgia, they had many meetings with the White House and with the DOJ. They went there, 8-hour meetings. That was all staged. That was a phony hoax, and now you look at it, and it is a phony hoax. And hopefully that case will be dismissed in short order. It's a disgrace to this country. But they work together with the Justice Department and the White House, and not supposed to do that.
Voters in Nevada will get the opportunity to cast their ballots for Donald Trump in today's caucuses. The GOP frontrunner is on his way to the Silver State, where he is on the ballot after declining to run in Tuesday's primary. Tonight's
CBS report said videos on the platform have detailed instructions for how to get to the border hole. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. The app has become massively popular in the U.S., but has also sparked controversies. Over 30 U.S. states have banned TikTok from government-issued devices due to security and data collection concerns, while some fear the app pushes dangerous content toward children.
Coming up, a landmark presidential election case. The Supreme Court hearing oral arguments in the Colorado ballot challenge that will decide former President Trump's eligibility for 2024. We bring you highlights from the hearing.
Section 3 cannot be used to exclude a presidential candidate from the ballot, even if that candidate is disqualified from serving as president under Section 3. Constitutional provision normally can still be enforced by a state if it chooses to enact legislation. The holding of Griffin's case goes beyond even that by saying that a state is not allowed to implement or enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment unless and until Congress enacts implementing legislation allowing it to do so. So under Griffin's case, which we believe is correctly decided, the Anderson litigants disagree with us on that point, but if this court were to adhere to the holding of Griffin's case, there would not be any role for the states in enforcing Section 3 unless Congress were to enact a statute that gives them that authority.
Counsel, one What if somebody came into a state Secretary of State's office and said, I took the oath specified in Section 3. I participated in an insurrection, and I want to be on the ballot. Does the Secretary of State have the authority in that situation to say, no, you're disqualified?
No, the Secretary of State could not do that consistent with term limits, because even if the candidate is an admitted insurrectionist, Section 3 still allows the candidate to run for office and even win election to office, and then see whether Congress lifts that disability after the election. This happened frequently in the wake of the 14th Amendment, where Confederate insurrectionists were elected to Congress, and sometimes they obtained a waiver, sometimes they did not, and each house would determine for itself whether to seat that elected insurrectionist, because each house is the sole judge of the qualifications of its members. So if a state banned even an admitted insurrectionist from the ballot, it would be adding to and altering the Constitution's qualifications for office, because under Section 3, the candidate need only qualify during the time the candidate holds the office to which he's been elected. And under Your Honor's hypothetical, the Secretary of State would be demanding, essentially, that the candidate obtain a waiver from Congress earlier than the candidate needs to obtain that waiver.
Well, even though it's pretty unlikely, or at least would be difficult for an individual who says, I am an insurrectionist and I had taken the oath, that would require 2/3 of votes in Congress, right?
Correct.
Well, this is a pretty unlikely scenario.
It may be unlikely, but no Secretary of State is permitted to predict the likelihood of a waiver, because in doing so, they're adding a new qualification to the ability to run for Congress. And the proper analogy, Mr. Chief Justice, is to state residency laws, because the Constitution says that a member of Congress must inhabit the state that he represents when elected. And the lower courts have all held, in reliance on term limits, that a state election official cannot move that deadline any earlier by requiring the candidate for Congress to inhabit the state.
Mr. Mitchell, if I may interrupt, but just to clarify, I mean, this sounds like your reply brief, where it sounds like you're not making a constitutional argument. You're really making a statutory preemption argument. And is that what you're doing here? You're not saying that the Constitution gives you this rule. It's the kind of combination of Griffin's case plus the way Congress acted after Griffin's case that gives you the rule?
That's exactly right, Justice Kagan, because we have implementing legislation. Congress took up the invitation provided by Griffin's case and established writs of quo warranto in the 1870 Enforcement Act, later repealed them. The only enforcement legislation that's is the Insurrection Criminal Statute, Section 2383. And when Congress made all of these decisions, the initial enactment of the Enforcement Act in 1870, the repeal of the quo warranto provisions in 1948, all of those were made with Griffin's case as the backdrop.
Please.
Well, the understanding was that these congressionally established remedies would be exclusive of state court remedies. So there's not an express statement of preemption in these statutes, but there didn't need to be, because Griffin's case provided the backdrop.
And if I could just understand the argument a little bit better, suppose that we took all of that away. Suppose there were no Griffin's case and there were no subsequent congressional enactment. What do you then think the rule would be?
So just as a matter of first principles without Griffin's case, it's a much harder argument for us to make, because normally, every other provision of the 14th Amendment has been treated as self-executing. What we would argue, and as hypothetical that Your Honor has suggested, is that there are practical considerations unique to Section 3 that counsel in favor of a rule similar to what Chief Justice Chase spelled out in Griffin's case. And it goes to, I think, the policy concerns he talks about, where this was a case, Griffin's case involved a convicted criminal who was seeking a writ of habeas corpus on the ground that the judge who tried his case was an insurrectionist disqualified under Section 3. And Chief Justice Chase realizes that if he enforces Section 3 in this situation, it would nullify every official act taken not only by this particular judge, but by anyone who is an insurrectionist or arguably an insurrectionist under Section 3.
Well, why do you need those consequential concerns, though? It kind of seems to me that what Justice Kagan is getting at is, why don't you have an argument that the Constitution of its own force, that Section 3 of its own force preempts the state's ability, not necessarily, I think, not to enforce Section 3 against its own officers, but against federal officers, like in a Tarbell's case kind of way.
So there could also be an argument that's more limited. You're suggesting there may be a barrier under the Constitution to a state legislating an enforcement mechanism for Section 3 specific to federal officers. We could rely on precedents such as McClung that says that state courts lack the authority to issue mandamus relief against federal officials.
Well, why aren't you making those arguments?
Because that doesn't get us, that Griffin's
case... That only gets you out of state court, doesn't get you out of federal court.
And also the holding of Griffin's case went well beyond that, because Chief Justice Chase said in this opinion, which again provided the backdrop for the congressional enforcement legislation, that states had no role in enforcing Section 3 unless Congress was to give them that authority through a statute that they passed pursuant to the
But your arguments...
Please, go ahead.
I was just going to add one last thing. I think your argument's a little broader than that, because I think if we accept your position that disqualifying someone from the ballot is adding a qualification, really your position is that Congress can't enact a statute that would allow Colorado to do what it's done either, because then Congress would be adding a qualification, which it can't do either.
No, I don't agree with that, Justice Barrett. Congress is not bound by the holding of term limits. Term limits only prohibits the states from adding additional qualifications or altering the Constitution's qualifications for federal office. It does not purport to restrain Congress. So if Congress were to enact implementing legislation that authorized the states to exclude insurrectionists from the ballot, we believe that would be valid enforcement legislation under Section 3, with an important caveat. There has to be congruence and proportionality under this court's precedents.
Well, why would that be permissible? Because Section 3 refers to the holding of office, not running for office. And so if a state or Congress were to go further and say that you can't run for the office, you can't compete in a primary, wouldn't that be adding an additional qualification for serving for president? You must have been free from this disqualification at an earlier point in time than Section 3 specifies.
I think the answer to your question, Justice Alito, depends on how you interpret the word enforce in Section 5. And some members of this court, such as Justice Scalia, thought that enforce means you can do nothing more than enact legislation that mirrors the 14th Amendment's self-executing requirements, and you can't go an inch beyond that. That's not the current jurisprudence of this court.
No, well, all right, we have to decide whether it's congruent and proportional, and we would get into the question of whether that would be congruent and proportional. Well, let me shift gear a little bit. I take you to argue, and I think this is right, that the term self-executing is a misnomer as applied here.
Yes,
very often, when we use the term, what we're referring to is the proposition that a particular provision
participated in an insurrection. It's also called the disqualification clause, which is what the challengers want to happen in this case. They want Trump to be disqualified from the ballot. Now, the relevant language of that law states, no person shall hold any office under the United States who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. So Trump's attorneys here have argued that the president is not an officer of the United States. President Trump did not engage in an insurrection, and only Congress can enforce Section 3. So what is the Supreme Court considering here? Today, they're considering, is the president an officer? Did Trump engage in this insurrection? And is Congress required to enforce Section 3? So at the end of the day, this is an election case, and whatever decision is made will likely impact all future presidential elections.
And Arlene, given the seriousness of this case, what could the Supreme Court do?
Well, let me give you a few scenarios. So let's start off with number one. The court can rule that the Colorado court got it right and Trump should be disqualified. Now, legal observers estimate that this is the least likely conclusion because it could cause a dramatic turn of events and shake the foundations of American democracy. Second, Trump is not an officer of the United States. They could decide that. So this could perhaps be the best outcome for the former president because it could prevent state courts from applying Section 3 to him at all. Now, one of the arguments has been that a state court cannot apply federal law. Third, the Supreme Court could agree that Congress has the power to remove Trump from the ballot. So they may toss the case to Congress. Now, several legal scholars who had submitted an amicus brief in this case are worried that if the justices send this case to Congress, it could lead to political violence because it would effectively invalidate Americans' votes for President Trump. And then lastly, they could remand the decision to state court for further deliberation. So another option would be to challenge the lower court's reasoning and send the case back for them to review it again based on an analysis that the Supreme Court provides, whatever that may be. This would also delay the matter and perhaps cause more unrest. So this decision could also impact the federal election case brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith.
Implying.
He hasn't said Trump engaged in an insurrection, but he is charging Trump with conspiring to obstruct a governmental proceeding. This case could also affect the January 6 individuals who are themselves bringing some cases in the future, and depending on how the court ultimately defines insurrection.
Oh, there's a lot for the court to consider here. Thank you so much for your report, Arlie.
Thank you.
State Senate Judiciary Committee passed a bill that would change this.
The bill, which now advances to the full floor, would establish a process for the chief elections officer.
Oh, my Lord, now the state's trying to change.
Now, the bill drew over 300 complaints.
I don't think that's legal.
With only about 20 favoring it.
In other election news, the Biden campaign is now ramping up coordination with lawmakers to reach voters nationwide. Senior officials for the Biden campaign are meeting with House Democrats today.
That's to outline details to campaign plans after Super Tuesday. The campaign aides will discuss their general election message and outlook for the year. They'll also focus on how lawmakers can
the socialists have to get together.
House Democrats are in Northern Virginia for their annual retreat. President Biden will travel there later today to deliver his own message to lawmakers. And President
buying up single-family homes. That's why rent is so expensive. Well, everyone, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and as always, please take care.
The initiative aims to integrate illegal immigrants into the state's workforce, targeting sectors like engineering, federal laws they say the administration has violated. They called on the administration to change direction right away. The top state officials say that stopping the export of LNG could hurt the country's safety and economy and empower Iran and Russia.
That's what they're trying to do.
Was set today to defend the LNG pause at a Senate hearing called by Senator Joe Manchin. Manchin calls the export pause a political ploy to pander to climate activists at the expense of American workers, businesses, and U.S. allies.
Coming up, Spanish farmers continue their protests and blocking streets and ports in northern Spain. It's part of a larger farmers' movement sweeping Europe, which in some areas have turned violent. We'll return with that and more after this break.
It would be an embarrassment for our country, an absolute nightmare for the Republican Party, if they reject national security funding twice in one day.
Nikki Haley lost the Nevada primary to none of these candidates. Haley suffered another setback in her presidential campaign. The former UN ambassador came in second at the Nevada Republican primary, in which she was the only candidate on Tuesday's first primary in years. Noticeably missing from the ballot, former president and current GOP frontrunner Donald Trump. He is standing instead in the Republican caucuses on Thursday. In an unusual move, Nevada is hosting both contests, though only the caucuses will prepare with delegates. Candidates must choose to participate in either the primary or the caucuses, but registered voters can vote in both if they chose to. This could explain why Nikki Haley finished the contest behind the ballot option, none of these candidates. Here's
because it doesn't require visas. From there, they go to Tijuana, a city in Mexico. From there, they pay smugglers a few $100 for a drive to a gap in the border. That's where TikTok comes into play. The CBS reports that videos on the platform have detailed instructions for how to get to the border hole. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. The app has become massively popular in the U.S., but has also sparked controversies. Over 30 U.S. states have banned TikTok from government-issued devices due to security and data collection concerns.
Banned the whole
Some
thing.
fear the app pushes dangerous content toward children. Reasons for the surge in illegal Chinese crossings vary. For one, it's getting harder for them to get tourist visas into the U.S. That's as tensions mount between the two countries. Plus, Chinese nationals seem to have a higher chance of being granted asylum. Over half of Chinese immigrants received asylum last year. That's compared to 14% of those from other countries. U.S. immigration courts have asked over 36,000 Chinese to leave, but China often won't take back its citizens. A tough question for Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. At a hearing Tuesday, a lawmaker questioned Yellen if she would commit to increasing the capital of the World Bank, conditional on graduating China from World Bank assistance and not allowing Beijing to increase its voting power.
Let me say we are strongly opposed to World Bank lending to China. We've pushed the World Bank and other MDBs to reduce and eliminate their lending volume to China.
The term MDB refers to multilateral development banks. They provide financial support to developing countries. The World Bank lends money to China because it's considered a developing country, even though it's the world's second largest economy. The organization has approved over $9 billion for projects in China
That's the
since
biggest
2016.
problem.